Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. Today I am going to introduce you to something that I think will help you tremendously as you go forward to try to witness for Christ. Now, look, there's a lot of different witnessing methods and programs and things like that. I've really tried to boil this down to something that's very, very simple and straightforward, something that you can remember. And this Paths to the Resurrection, this PATHS, this is an acronym that we'll go through. If you only remember the acronym, you'll be able to give a very brief witness for Christ. You can always fill the details in later. Listen, you do not have to have every single answer to every challenge presented or to every question that's asked. Look, even Peter says, you got to give the hope for, your reason for having it to people that ask. You want to give a defense for your faith. Well, this is going to help you do that. And if you don't have a specific answer or piece of information, that's fine. As you walk through this PATHS acronym, you'll see that it is so simple, yet at the same time, you can always come back and say, I'll get you that information, or I don't have that right now, but I'll provide that back to you. Let me email it to you, send it to you, text it to you, whatever. You can get the information to people, but this should make it very, very simple. So to jump right in and listen, please hit the like or subscribe button if this is going to help you. I'd appreciate that. So the outline is very, very simple. The P stands for predictive prophecy. Okay. The A stands for archaeology. The T stands for transmission of documents. The H stands for historicity. The S stands for secular sources. And then we'll sum it up at the end. And then I'll talk about how this paths brings us to the resurrection, which you've really done the work, the lion's share of it. When you talk about predictive prophecy, archaeology, the documents, the historicity of them, and then the secular sources, those outside of the Bible. Some of you are looking at this and saying, wow, this, I know what he's going to put under each one of these headings. So, this is all you need, right? I will give you some detail through this presentation. However, you don't need all the detail in order to use this. When somebody says, well, how do you know the Bible's true? Oh, well, let me tell you. Predictive prophecy. I mean, there's no other book in the world in ancient history or currently or has ever been that has predictive prophecy that we know has been fulfilled. Archaeology. Every time the archaeologist Spade overturns something else, it always supports the Bible, never detracts from it, but always supports it and reveals some very specific things that really would only be that way because the Bible tells us ahead of time. So when we discover them archaeologically, it's not just a general finding, but there's specifics involved. Transmission of documents. Well, how do we know that the transmission of Old and New Testament manuscripts, especially New Testament manuscripts, wasn't like the telephone game, passing it around the room. And then, you come to the last person that gets the whisper at the end of the room, and then it's nothing like the first person said. Well, we know that because of how the documents were transmitted. And the transmission of documents is very simple. At a high level, it's easy to understand. And then because we don't know if those documents, though they were copied correctly, did they tell the truth? That's the historicity. Are they actual representative documents of historical events? And then we can look outside the Bible. There are people outside the Bible in ancient history, very close to the source, that confirm everything in the New Testament especially. So we'll sum that up and then we'll talk about the paths to the resurrection. But I'm very excited because this is a great opportunity for you to put something very simple into your pocket that is very easy to remember, especially as we go through it. So let's jump in. The first one, the P, predictive prophecy. So predictive prophecy is an objective evidence. In other words, understanding that something has been predicted and has been fulfilled has nothing to do with my bias. It is objective to the actual event or evidence itself. So this is important because we want the evidence that we present to others to be objective, not subject to me, my biases, but really focused on the evidence itself. So we have evidence throughout the Old Testament, prophecy regarding Israel that was fulfilled. Now, obviously, we can't go through all of them. If you have a study Bible, it's going to give you probably a lot of information on that, as well as if you have a Bible commentary for the Old Testament. But let's take a couple of examples here. For example, there are multiple prophecies that anticipated the captivity of Israel for 70 years in Babylon. Not 69, not 71, 70 exactly. It's mentioned in Jeremiah 25 and 29, and then later it's referenced by Daniel in the book of Daniel in chapter 9. And though we're not going to go into it in this presentation, I mean, if you were to go through, the typical bullseye that I've gone through in my New Testament reliability presentation under the apologetics playlist on the channel here, then, we'd get to the place where, the timing of the Messiah is given in Daniel chapter 29 with the 77-year periods determined upon Israel. And we get right up into the time where Jesus entered Jerusalem on the donkey, fulfilling Zechariah 9:9. But not going into all that detail here because I want to keep it at a pretty high level. But there are other prophecies contained in the Old Testament that were fulfilled prior to the New Testament or the time when Jesus came. So, we even have, now that's regarding Israel, and in the Old Testament we have prophecy regarding Gentile nations. Now those are nations outside of Israel. So it's not like this is just contained in Israel. Predictive prophecy has to do with other nations in their relation to Israel, but they are other nations nonetheless. We have the example in Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Daniel ended up interpreting the dream for him, and that tells about the four major governing world empires. The first one is Babylon, then the second one is Media-Persian Empire, then the Grecian Empire, the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was not conquered by another nation. It just kind of dissolved from within. It collapsed internally, but will revive through the 10 toes that is speaking of, that is yet to occur, and that will occur during the 7-year tribulation period that we've talked about a lot prophetically, at least on this channel. And then you have Ezekiel 26 with the judgment of Tyre or Tyrus. And it talks about first by Nebuchadnezzar, and then afterwards, 13 years later, after Nebuchadnezzar came in, basically what happened was historically, Tyre, the Phoenicians had a navy. They ended up, as they were attacked by the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, they created this, they had a wall surrounding the city, but on the back end, they could offload all their goods and people to ships, and they effectively brought them out to an island not far offshore. And so they did that over the course of years, and because they could bring food and everything in on ships, they could maintain themselves against Nebuchadnezzar. Finally, when they had enough people out on the island, Nebuchadnezzar did overtake the city, and then was kind of an empty victory. There wasn't much left there. Now, Alexander the Great came in after that, and he basically razed the city, R-A-Z-E-D, right? He cut it all down, took all the rubble, and basically made a causeway out to that island, and then they rode out there and then defeated them. But all this is really very detailed, and it's in Ezekiel 26. So, these are prophecies that were anticipated and then also fulfilled historically. So Daniel, is so specific in chapter 2 and chapter 9 that liberal scholars tried to claim that the book of Daniel was written much later after all these events occurred, which was ridiculous because it was translated into the Greek Old Testament and the Septuagint. That was around 250 BC. So some of these things were being accomplished, yet to be accomplished, and it was already written down, and that was copied from the Hebrew Bible. So the liberal scholars, they gave it a shot in trying to maintain their position because they just simply don't believe the Bible. However, the reality is, and the timing of everything shows, that Daniel was written around 600 BC and anticipated the entire, basically, Gentile world governing situation from Babylon all the way through to Rome. Now, how about prophecy anticipating the Messiah, right? Just in his first coming. Now, the example I'm going to give you is an old example. It's from 1958. This guy, Peter Stoner, he wrote a book called Science Speaks, and in chapter 3, he was a professor in Texas. With his class, Stoner calculated the probability of just 8 messianic prophecies being fulfilled in the life of Jesus. As you read through these prophecies, you'll see all estimates are calculated as conservatively as possible. So these are the 8 that he used for his calculation. Person would have to be born in Bethlehem, right, according to Micah 5:2. There was a messenger to prepare the way, Malachi 3:1. He would enter Jerusalem riding on a donkey, Zechariah 9:9. He was betrayed by a friend, Zechariah 13:6. He was betrayed specifically for 30 pieces of silver, Zechariah 11:12. And the betrayal money was used to buy a potter's field, Zechariah 11:13. He made no defense for himself, Isaiah 53:7. And then the Messiah will die having his hands and feet pierced, Psalm 22:16. So these 8 prophecies he used, in other words, the chance factor that these mathematically could have occurred in one person. Well, first of all, they have to occur in the life of the Messiah. And did they occur in anybody? Okay. So you multiply all the probabilities together, and it produces a number rounded off of 1 in 2.8 times 10 to the times 1,028. So you divide the number by an estimate of the number of people who lived since the time of these prophecies, right? So you have to estimate about 88 billion people lived since then, and it produces a number of all 8 prophecies being fulfilled accidentally in the life of one person. That probability is 1 in 1,018, or 1 with 18 zeros after it, right? In other words, it's really mathematically impossible. It's mathematically impossible for one person to just fulfill these specific prophecies. I don't think we realize how difficult this is. If I said, hey, it's going to rain tomorrow. Well, you say, you get a 50-50 shot. If I say it's going to rain in Boston, but it's not going to rain in Dorchester, which is kind of a suburb of Boston. You say, well, that's getting pretty specific. If I say it's going to rain between 1 and 2 in the afternoon, every time I add something to it, it becomes more and more difficult for that to be fulfilled. When you say that there was somebody born in Bethlehem, you can only have so many people that were born in Bethlehem. Okay? So, especially, if you count until today, but if you were to go back into the time of Jesus, when all the genealogies and everything else, because the Messiah would come genealogically through not only the tribe of Judah, but through the lineage of David specifically. I mean, they're just not keeping the genealogies anymore. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 A.D. Nobody knows really, who's coming from what genealogy, but the Messiah can only be born in Bethlehem. So you see how specific these things have to get. Now, these prophecies don't include over 50 other unique prophecies that are related to the Messiah's first coming alone, not to mention the hundreds in the second coming, okay? So this is coming number one. And so I think, we're starting to get an idea that predictive prophecy is a tremendously powerful apologetic for the Bible and ultimately for the resurrection. So this is something, again, this is a little detail. However, at the same time, there is a tremendous amount of prophecies that can be looked at, and they don't get any simpler as you keep adding them into the mix. So that's predictive prophecy. How about archaeology? Well, when we look at archaeology, again, it's an objective evidence because it is based on what's found or uncovered. It's not subjective. The only aspect of archaeology that is subjective is the interpretation of the archaeologist. However, if the archaeological discovery matches with what the Bible claims to be true, then it correlates to the Bible and it is just another piece of the foundation put in. The Bible doesn't need every single thing archaeologically discovered in order for it to be true. It just needs for nothing to come out that says that it's not true, and we've never found anything to date. The more that they uncover archaeologically, the more that it supports the Bible each time. Now, there are Old Testament discoveries that validate the Bible's history. For example, the city of Jericho. So I'm going to let Joel Kramer, who has a channel on YouTube called Expedition Bible, and I would highly, highly recommend that you go to that channel and then, watch his videos. They're very beneficial. But let's sit back and listen to what he has to say as he gives us some information on Jericho.
So this is cave number 4.
This is cave number 4. Yeah, right out of this very section came sections of the book of Joshua, the sections we have from Qumran.
And so how important do you think it is to use the biblical text and the archaeology that's been done at Jericho to interpret what's been found there?
Well, it's extremely important because, one, it's an historical document.
Really, the only ancient text that you have to work with for here is the biblical text, right?
Biblical text, yes. We have no other references to Jericho outside the Bible.
And no other Old Testament book has more historical information about Jericho than the book of Joshua. In regards to Jericho, it is important for us to understand that the book of Joshua is our only voice from the ancient past that speaks of what happened there over 3,000 years ago.
The Bible's an ancient text, and the book of Joshua is an ancient text, and so we know the story in the book of Joshua is an ancient account. So when the archaeologists excavated at Jericho, did they find evidence that matched that text or not?
In 1907, a German team began the first major excavation work at Jericho.
They were able to trace around the outside perimeter of the tell the lower retaining wall that holds in place the earthen embankment around the tell.
This short section of stone wall can still be seen at Tel Jericho today. But what was the purpose of a retaining wall like this one?
When I pour this bucket of dirt out, it spreads out across a flat ground. However, if I make a circle of stones and I pour the bucket of dirt into it, then the dirt is retained by the stone wall surrounding it.
This is the stone retaining wall which held in place the earthen embankment that surrounded the city. And on top of the stone retaining wall was the mud brick wall.
On top of this stone foundational retaining wall, there was another wall, the city wall, which was made out of mud bricks.
The three teams that dug Jericho were the German team from 1907 to 1909, John Garstang in the 1930s and Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. Using the excavation reports from these three digs, we were able to reconstruct what the city of Jericho would have looked like in the time of Joshua.
Both the stone wall and the mud brick wall on top of it made up the outer wall that surrounded the city. Further up the embankment was another mud brick wall. This wall is what the Israelites were looking at as they marched around the city. This stone-facing wall, on top of it, a high mud brick wall. As they were marching around the city, they must have been thinking, how are we going to capture this city? Because it is so well fortified.
Referring to our ancient text, Joshua 6:20 says that on the seventh day, at the sound of the trumpets, the wall collapsed.
And the Bible is very specific in how it describes that event. The Hebrew wording there is the walls takatha, fell beneath themselves. And on the seventh trip around, we're told in the Bible, the mud brick wall collapsed and it fell outward and down to the base of the stone retaining wall. And when the archaeologists dug in this area, they found this pile of mud bricks all the way along the retaining wall.
So where I am right now is where the pile of red bricks were found.
That's correct.
The Germans, Garstang, and Kenyon all found these piles of collapsed mud bricks while excavating at the base of the stone retaining wall.
Then she shows that she dug down the side of that the outside of that revetment wall, and then there were reddish collapsed bricks that she said came from the top of that stone wall.
Yes. Which is another reason to suppose that these weren't, there were walls on top. They're not in situ, but the collapsed brick has come down, yes. If you have a brick wall sitting on top of a stone revetment and it falls over, where else can the bricks go? They've got to go to the bottom.
And so with that pile of bricks, what does that tell us? Does that tell us that there was a destruction of the wall?
Certainly. It certainly is evidence of that destruction.
These fallen bricks from the city wall can be seen in this diagram from Kenyon's excavation report. In her write-up, she makes it clear that it was not the stone retaining wall that fell, but rather the mud brick wall that once stood on top of it.
And so she writes that up in her report, that here we have a collapsed city wall, and here's the evidence for it.
The archaeological understanding of how the walls of Jericho fell matches well with the ancient description of the wall falling beneath itself.
This find of a collapsed city wall found here at Jericho is unique in archaeology. At no other site have we found evidence for a city wall that has fallen down.
Yes, there were remains of the mud brick that had fallen down. I mean, that wall came tumbling down.
So the Bible says that the wall came tumbling down. The archaeologists then came and dug Jericho, and what did they find? They found a collapsed city wall. This fits perfectly with the description from the ancient text.
And when you have that text, and you have the archaeology, and you can fit them together, then you have the evidence from both sides, the literary evidence and the actual physical evidence from what the Bible is talking about.
Another interesting detail regarding the walls of Jericho is found in Joshua 6:20. It says that after the walls collapsed, the Israelites went up into the city. Kenyon's excavation report shows that the pile of fallen mud bricks could have been used as a ramp by the charging Israelites. Because that would be a problem, wouldn't it? I mean, if the soldiers were charging, there was a mud brick wall up there. Even with that mud brick wall gone, I mean, what are they supposed to do? I mean, climb up the wall to attack. So what Kenyon's report says is that mud brick wall collapsed off of this foundation, and it went all the way up to the top of the rim there, and it formed a ramp like this so that when the charging army would come, they could have run up into the city to attack it.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly what the Bible says. Each man went before him straight up into the city, and they could do that by just climbing up over that pile of collapsed mud bricks, up over the top of the stone retaining wall, up the embankment, and into the city.
Josh?
So this is this is Joel Kramer. Like I say, he does a great job. You would really benefit from going to his site if you're interested at all in archaeology. And again, on YouTube, he's got the channel called Expedition Bible. I'd highly recommend it. But that's Jericho. Now, there's also liberal scholars for years they criticize the Bible because the Bible mentions Hittites, and there was never any Hittite discovery. So, on this, in this old article here, it says, and you get the link there if you're interested in it. It says, although the Hittites are mentioned 48 times in the scriptures, even Bible believers would scarcely have dared to envision an empire so vast as modern finds have disclosed, stretching from northern Syria to include all of Asia Minor. The story of the discovery of this lost empire must certainly go down in history as one of the greatest sagas of exploration ever told. Now, again, the reason this is really interesting is because for so many years the Bible was criticized because they had not had an archaeological find of the Hittites, okay? The article goes on, and I pulled some information out of it. You can read the full article yourself. It says the first scholar to publicly claim evidence for the identification of the lost Hittites was Archibald Henry Sayce, who in 1879 wrote a paper entitled The Hittites in Asia Minor. In 1884, William Wright published a book entitled The Empire of the Hittites. It was with this that the story of the Hittitology may be said to have begun. No longer could the claims be discarded or the Hittites ignored. The first major excavations to be carried out on a Hittite site were undertaken in 1888 at Zenjurli in the southern foothills of the Taurus Mountains. In 1906, the first major excavations were begun at Bogozokoi by Hugo Winkler. Winkler's work was continued in 1907. John Garstang visited Bos-Hazkoi, however you pronounce that, and in 1910 published The Land of the Hittites, an account of recent explorations and discoveries in Asia Minor with descriptions of the Hittite monuments, with maps and plans, 99 photographs, and a bibliography. This impressive volume became the standard work in Hittitology for many years. George Smith's finding the missing tablets of the Gilgamesh epic at Nineveh, unbelievable find, was made in 1947 by Helmut T. Bossert, including the Great Stone Lion. What he found was a Phoenician inscription that proved to be the longest old Phoenician running text so far discovered, along with the hieroglyphic Hittite version of the same text. So again, there's a lot more information in the article. If you're interested in it, you can just go to the link that was up there. But again, the Hittites was one of the major discoveries, of late. Now, there's New Testament discoveries also that validate the Gospels and the resurrection. For example, the Pilate stone. And we'll let Frank Turek tell us about this because he does a good job at it.
Another biblical character we know who existed via archaeology is Pontius Pilate. In 1961, in the coastal town of Caesarea in northern Israel, a stone was discovered which says Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. We not only know he existed from this stone, but Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived from 37 AD to about 100 AD, mentions Pontius Pilate in his writings. He also mentions Jesus. He also mentions James and John the Baptist and some other characters in the Bible. We know these people actually existed from archaeology, some of them, and also from writers like Josephus.
So there were also ossuaries that were discovered, right? So this one has the inscription, James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, which was highly unusual. Now, this ossuary was from Jesus. It would be his half-brother James, right? And this was from between 20 BC and 70 AD. That's how they date it. Josephus said James was executed in 62 AD. Okay, so that would fall within that time frame. It was unusual to have the brother of a deceased listed in the inscription. However, Jesus was so popular and there was so much made of him, obviously, in the first century, that it would make sense that that would be. And there was actually a court case in 2008 that verified the authenticity of the inscription because it was challenged so much. So again, we also have the ossuary of Joseph Caiaphas, who was the high priest during the time when Jesus was crucified. And again, we'll let Frank tell you about that.
One of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries which authenticates a major character in the Bible is the Caiaphas ossuary. This was discovered in 1990 in Jerusalem. What's an ossuary? It's a limestone box that the Jews used from about 20 BC to 70 AD. What would happen if somebody important died? They would inter the body about a year later. They would take the bones out of the grave and put them in this ossuary, this limestone box, and reinter the remains. Well, in 1990, they discovered this very ornate ossuary that on the side of it identified the remains as the remains of Caiaphas. Who is Caiaphas? He was the high priest that sentenced Jesus to die. When Jesus said, "I am the Messiah, and you will see the Son of Man coming with great power on the clouds," Caiaphas tore his robe and said, "Blasphemy, this man must die." The man that sentenced Jesus to die, we not only know he existed, we have his bones. When they discovered this ossuary, they discovered the bones of a 60-year-old man and his family. There's only one Caiaphas known from history, and that's the Caiaphas of the New Testament who sentenced Jesus to die. We not only know he existed, we have his burial box.
We also have information on a crucified victim. And again, the reason that this is important is because it was challenged whether the Romans actually crucified people and all that. So we'll look at this. And this was discovered in 1968. And I think Joel Kramer will do a great job explaining this one to you.
Welcome to Expedition Bible. I'm Joel Kramer. Today I'm going to be talking about the archaeological evidence for crucifixion. In the New Testament, we have a detailed account of Jesus' crucifixion. And for example, in Acts 2:23, it says of Jesus, they put him to death by nailing him to the cross. Is there any archaeological evidence that the Romans put Jews to death by nailing them to crosses? In 1968, in the northeast area of Jerusalem, a tomb was discovered and excavated. And inside this tomb was found one of these limestone bone boxes called an ossuary. And inside of the ossuary were found the remains, according to the excavation report, of an individual male between 24 and 28 years old. Now, according to the excavation report, both of the ankle bones of this individual had been pierced by an iron nail, and this undoubtedly was a case of crucifixion. In fact, one of the heel bones of this individual had a nail still embedded through it. We know the name of this individual because it's inscribed onto the ossuary itself. His name is Yehohanan. And so this embedded nail through Yehohanan's ankle is on display at the Israel Museum, but this is a replica. The real artifact is kept in a lab down in the Department of Anatomy and Anthropology at the University of Tel Aviv, where it's still studied by scholars today. And if you look at the nail sticking through Yehohanan's ankle bone, you'll see that the tip is bent. And what is believed to have happened is that when it was driven through his ankle into the wooden beam, it hit a knot of wood and that bent the tip of the nail. So when the Romans came to retrieve the nail to reuse it, it was stuck. And they ended up having to cut it out of the wood. And so Yehohanan ended up being buried with the nail still sticking through his ankle, which allowed this archaeological evidence to be preserved and to be found later by archaeologists. The drawing of Yehohanan is only of his lower half because it's undetermined how his hands were attached to the cross. However, we know from the archaeological evidence that his feet were nailed to either side of the beam of the cross through his ankle bones. So there's no question that Yehohanan ended his life nailed to a cross. In 1970, another tomb nearby this first one was discovered and excavated, and inside of it also was found an ossuary. And inside of this ossuary, 3 iron nails were found with bones still fused to them. So these bones were originally turned over to Dr. Niku Haas, who was the leading physical anthropologist in Israel at the time. He studied them and determined that this was further evidence for crucifixion, that this individual, who he determined to be about a 25-year-old male, ended his life nailed to a cross through his hands, and it was his hand bones that were still fused onto these nails. Now, these nails are also kept at the same lab down at the University of Tel Aviv, and they have been studied today by Dr. Israel Hershkovitz. And Dr. Hershkovitz has studied them intensively under a very high-powered microscope, and he has determined that when the nails were driven through this individual's hands, that it broke some of the hand bones, and it's the bones from his hand bones that are fused still to these nails. Dr. Hershkovitz is in agreement with the original interpretation by Dr. Haas that this is, in fact, further evidence of crucifixion, that this individual died being nailed to the cross through his hands. Now, in this case, they're not sure how his feet were attached to the cross, and so we have the illustration based on the archaeological evidence showing the upper part of this man's body and how his hands were nailed to the cross. So when we bring these two illustrations together, we get this composite view of a crucified man from the 1st century AD, the time of Jesus, based on archaeological evidence of what crucifixion looked like at that time, and it matches perfectly with the descriptions that we have in the New Testament of Jesus' crucifixion. Again, Acts 2:23 says that they put him to death by nailing him to the cross.
We also have, after his resurrection in John 20:25, the disciple Thomas, who felt the nail marks in his hands where the nails were. And so this image that we have of Jesus nailed to a cross through his hands and his feet is supported by the archaeological evidence.
So I think Joel did a great job of explaining that, and again, how important it is to have these archaeological discoveries. So we have a little time. Let's see how far we can get into the transmission of documents. So what is that? Well, basically, the transmission of historical documents that make up the Bible, it's objective evidence that they are copied and distributed accurately. The manuscripts, as we're looking at, especially the New Testament, were distributed in such a way that it was easy to see whether the copying was accurate. And for the Old Testament, it was a little bit simpler because the Jews maintained them very well. But for the New Testament, the church was spread out. It was in Judea, Asia Minor, Europe, North Africa. So there was a much larger geography to cover and to get the copies of what the New Testament was to those churches. So manuscript copying and distribution is accurate, and we know that. Even liberal scholars that do manuscript study know that. They don't believe what the manuscripts say, but they agree that they are accurately copied, that there's no way to really question what is taught in the New Testament because of it. And excuse me, the importance of this is to know that it's not the telephone game, okay? That, though they would have places where they would make a whole bunch of hand copies and get them out to other churches, and then they would copy them. At least the responsibility for maintaining them was distributed throughout the whole church in all the geographical areas and not one central location, which actually would have been worse. So there's about 5,800 Greek, 9,000, 10,000 Latin, and other manuscripts, which if they're, the New Testament originally is in Greek, and then they're translated into other languages, Latin, Coptic, Nubian, Syrian. There's a bunch of languages, that they're translated into, but there's a ton of manuscripts. There's thousands of them to make for comparisons.
When you think about the comparison in terms of the number of copies we have for the Gospels versus other ancient documents, I can say in general that the copies we have of the Gospels are far, far more numerous than any other thing we have in the Greco-Roman world, including Homer, which comes in a distant second. And I'm splitting that between the Odyssey and the Iliad. We have, as I've mentioned, about 5,800 manuscripts in Greek of the New Testament. Most of those are going to have Gospels or part of the Gospels in them. Then we have other ancient translations of the New Testament, beginning with Latin in the 2nd century. We have about 10,000 copies of Latin. Again, most of those are of the Gospels, and then they'll have other portions as well. We have Coptic, Syriac, Georgian, Gothic, Old Church Slavonic, Armenian, Arabic, Aramaic, numerous languages, and those languages, not counting the Latin, come to at least 5,000, probably more than 10,000 copies. So when you gather all this material together, for the whole New Testament or portions of the New Testament, we've got at least 20,000 copies of the New Testament in some form of these ancient languages. If you were to wipe all those out, and you had a magic wand, you could just destroy all of them in one fell swoop, we'd still be able to reproduce virtually the entire New Testament just from the writings of the church fathers alone, because they commented on the New Testament and they did not have the gift of brevity. And so these church fathers, we have over 1 million quotations of the church fathers from the New Testament. Once again, the Gospels are the primary things that they quote from. Now, let's compare that to just the average classical author. The average classical Greek or Latin author has fewer than 20 copies of his writings still in existence. Far fewer typically, sometimes 1 or 2. Sometimes we have such massive gaps that somebody will mention, I've written these 35 books and we only have 18 of them, or only 4 of them left in existence. Sometimes we're waiting 1,000 years before we see our earliest copy. But let's say the average classical author has 20 copies, to be on the very generous side. You stack those up, they'll be about 4 feet high. Stack up the New Testament manuscripts in the various languages, not counting the patristic quotations, and the stack would be more than 1 mile high. So the comparison, there is no comparison. It's just a massive disparity. What you're dealing with classical literature is a dearth of evidence. What you're dealing with the New Testament is an embarrassment of riches.
The question of whether we can be confident that we have reconstructed documents extremely close to the originals that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would have originally produced is another place where there's a lot of misinformation in society. Textual critics of all or no theological perspectives agree that with all the New Testament documents, and particularly with the Gospels, we can go back with a high degree of confidence to documents as early as the 2nd century, which may well have been copied directly from the manuscripts that were the first editions, if you like, of the 4 Gospels. And that as these texts emerge, we have larger and larger fragments preserved until, as we move into the 3rd century, we have nearly complete Gospels, and in the 4th and 5th centuries, nearly complete New Testaments. These represent amounts of evidence for which no other document or collection of documents anywhere in the ancient world enjoys. It's a luxury of evidence. And so while none of this proves that what the gospel writers were saying was necessarily all true, it certainly is more than adequate to show we know what their original claims were.
So, just so we understand, Dr. Wallace talked about the quantity of documents, and then Dr. Bloomberg talked about the accuracy. So, like Dr. Bloomberg says, that doesn't mean that what they copied, though it was copied accurately, it doesn't mean that what they copied was true. We have to examine it in other ways to make that determination, right? So, before we get into that, though, just to mention, the Jews kept the Old Testament within Israel, and an ancient find demonstrates the accuracy of the Old Testament along with the LXX, which is the Septuagint, and Dead Sea Scrolls. So there were also some very ancient finds for the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. There's there's a lot of evidence here. I'm trying to give you a little bit of a highlight on this. And for this, this is older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls was a tremendous find. It validated so much that we already had, and because it was older, it was able to, especially for the Old Testament and some of the New Testament, validate older copies to show that the later copies were copied accurately. But I think this will probably be the last thing that we'll look into, and then we'll continue next time. But you got to listen to this with Joel Kramer.
I have this incredible urge to tug on the back of your shirt. And so amazingly, Dr. Barkay got what he'd hoped for, what he'd dreamed of, and that is the discovery of a tomb chamber that had never been touched, that had never been robbed out in antiquity.
Finds represent the only repository which was found intact to be known in Jerusalem to date. Inside this single chamber we had more than 1,000 objects.
So then they started excavating the repository chamber. So we have this layer system within the repository chamber, with the layers at the bottom being the earliest and the layers at the top being the latest. I want to see where exactly. So, oh wow, that is deep.
You have a foothold.
Right here to the left, yeah. Okay, Dr. Barkay.
Yeah.
So where in here did you find those
Close
scrolls?
to the bottom and in the inner side.
The inside back, all the way back here?
The order usually is that people take stuff from the benches, they put it into the mouth of the repository, and it accumulates near the mouth of the repository, and then they come and move it inwards, and the new load comes in through the entrance. So whatever is close to the bottom and close to the innermost part is the earliest.
So in the back of the repository chamber, down at the bottom layer, right next to the true rock floor, the excavators found two small metal objects. These two items were plaques of silver rolled up like scrolls. Essentially, they are two small silver scrolls.
It was a plaque of silver which was rolled around itself about 6 times, and when it was unrolled it was showing to be covered densely with ancient Hebrew characters. It was inscribed 19 lines of writing in minuscule Hebrew characters. The first word which I deciphered at the opening was the name of the Lord. Yud Hey Vav Hey. This is the private name of God which appears whenever the English version has the word the Lord in the Hebrew Bible. This is the unpronounceable Tetragrammaton, the secret name of God.
In the Bible, in 2 Kings 21:4, Yahweh says, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." And in verse 7, Yahweh declares, "In Jerusalem I will put my name forever." So now, amazingly, the name Yahweh has been found archaeologically in an excavation in the city that bears his name.
For the first time we have the owner of the temple, the dweller of the temple of Jerusalem, found in Jerusalem itself. Later on we discovered that there are several more appearances of the name of the Lord on that piece of silver.
Not only was there Hebrew writing on these silver scrolls from Ketef Hinnom, but it was realized that what was written on them comes directly from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament.
Both of them had versions of the priestly benediction, which is mentioned in the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verses 24 to 26.
The first silver scroll reads, "Bless you, Yahweh, and keep you. May Yahweh shine his face upon you and be gracious to you." And the smaller scroll is translated, "Bless you, Yahweh, and keep you. May shine Yahweh his face upon you and give you peace."
And more than that, the burial customs and the comparative material you have is very clearly evident of First Temple period, beyond any doubt.
The history of Jerusalem is often broken into two time periods, the First Temple period and the Second Temple period. The First Temple period begins when Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem in the 10th century BC, and it's destroyed by the Babylonians in 586. BC, which brings the First Temple period to an end. The Second Temple period begins when Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple in Jerusalem, and it is destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So the Hebrew in the Second Temple period looks different than the earlier Hebrew that's used in the First Temple period. So if we use the name Yahweh as an example, in the Hebrew of the Second Temple period, God's name looks like this. But on the silver scrolls from Ketef Hinnom, it looks like this. The difference is a later form of Hebrew used in the Second Temple period, where the Hebrew found at Ketef Hinnom is an earlier form from the First Temple period. And so this is why the silver scrolls are dated to the First Temple period, and more specifically to the 7th century BC.
So that's pretty interesting stuff. And again, this is just a little bit of a snippet that you can get from going to Expedition Bible.
Let's start a little bit with the Old Testament manuscripts, because we talked to Peter about the New Testament manuscripts. How many manuscripts of the Old Testament do we have in existence?
Yeah, so this is still kind of unknown. Yeah, it's not as nailed down as on the New Testament side. I used to think we maybe had around 6,000, but I think the most recent number honestly has us up around 30,000.
That many?
Manuscripts is a lot of manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible.
Wow.
If you start to take all the fragments that were discovered at the Cairo Geniza, so this was a Geniza was a storage room of the old synagogue in Cairo, some 10,000 or so biblical fragments found there. And then also the Dead Sea Scrolls, some 200 or so fragments there. And then you start to put together the Masoretic tradition proper, that's thousands of manuscripts there. The Jewish, or the National Library of Israel also is up into the tens of thousands of manuscripts.
Now, I know when it comes to Greek New Testament manuscripts, we're just under 6,000 or so, right?
That's right.
Are you saying that the Hebrew versions of the Bible, the Old Testament, we have more than 6,000?
Yeah, we have more.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not complete, right?
Right.
Yeah. So just like the New Testament manuscripts are not complete, but no, the Hebrew Bible is incredibly well preserved. But I think that's a little known fact.
Let's start a little bit with the Old Testament manuscripts, because we talked to Peter about the New Testament manuscripts. How many manuscripts of the Old Testament do we have in existence?
Yeah. So this is still kind of unknown. Yeah, it's not as nailed down as on the New Testament side. I used to think we maybe had around 6,000, but I think the most recent number honestly has us up around 30,000.
That many?
Manuscripts is a lot of manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible.
Wow.
If you start to take all the fragments that were discovered at the Cairo Geniza.
Let's start a little bit with the Old Testament manuscripts, because we talked to Peter about
that keeps on running. But so we get also notice here it says the church distributed manuscripts to Judea, Asia Minor, Europe, and North Africa. I apologize for that. It just keeps kind of repeating. And this helps us because, like here, it says the distribution over time and geography tracked by copying errors that are like postage stamps. So not to get into this because, we're pushing an hour here and I want to, we'll continue with the rest of it next time. I'll be able to finish it off. But just so that we understand, when we talk about errors, and I go into detail on this in the New Testament reliability presentation under apologetics in this channel. It's in the playlist there. But the error, if you have a misspelling, if you have a letter difference, you have any variation at all, it's an error. And if you have that same thing in a number of 2,000 manuscripts, 2,000 errors. Now, what it doesn't mean is that you don't know what the manuscript is saying, because if you have a whole bunch of manuscripts, and at this point we have thousands, right? But if you have all those manuscripts and then you're able to even if you had 10 and you could make the comparison, because of the different errors in it, because they're not all in the same place, or it's not all the same misspelled word or whatever, you still know what it says. In other words, there's never a challenge to what is it actually saying. That doesn't exist. And the good thing about errors, we think it's bad because the skeptics use errors in a bad way. There's that old adage that figures don't lie, but liars sure can figure. And, the figures are that there is a lot of errors in the New Testament with all the manuscripts that we have. That's true. However, they don't change what it says, and they give a good indication in many of the manuscripts, like where they were copied from, how they were distributed, because the errors are copied and sent out to different geographies, and they're like a postage stamp that has a mark on it so that they can be tracked. And so this is actually, though it sounds counterintuitive, it's more beneficial because of the errors than if you didn't have any errors in them. And it's just amazing as you get into all this, you look at it, you realize, what God did to give us both the Old and the New Testament, but the transmission of documents is accurate. And there's just no way around that. So we've done the predictive prophecy, archaeological finds, and then PA, and here's the T, transmission of documents, and then we'll finish off with the H and the S next time, and then talk about kind of summing everything up. So until next time, I hope this is beneficial for you, but until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.